Welcome once again to Godfrey's Story Time. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel, kindly subscribe to this channel because this is the home of quality stories. Let's listen to one of those quality stories that I'm talking about today. Kindly, let's listen.
The morning air outside Callaway County Courthouse smelled like rain and cut grass. I was standing at the bottom of the wide stone steps, holding my handbag close to my chest, when Diana's hand closed around the collar of my coat. She yanked me to the side like I was a piece of luggage blocking a doorway. Her face was so close to mine I could smell her perfume. It was expensive and sharp. Her eyes were narrow and full of something ugly. "You embarrassing old fool," she whispered, each word bitten off clean and cold. "Go home before you make things worse." She didn't whisper it quietly the way a person whispers a secret. She said it loud enough for people to hear. A young woman with a stroller stopped walking. Two men in suits slowed their steps. A court officer at the top of the stairs turned his head. Diana wanted an audience. She had always wanted an audience. My daughter-in-law Diana Cole, born Diana Marsh, was the kind of woman who performed everything, including cruelty. She let go of my collar and stepped back, smoothing her jacket like she had simply moved a coat from a chair. She didn't look back at me. She walked up those courthouse steps like she owned every single one. My son Thomas walked just behind her, his eyes aimed at the ground. He had seen what she did. He had felt the ripple of it. The people around us had seen it too. But Thomas Cole, my only son, my boy, the child I had raised alone from the age of 7, kept walking. He didn't reach for me. He didn't speak my name. He didn't even slow his stride. He followed his wife through the tall glass doors and they closed behind him like a curtain. I stood at the bottom of those steps for a moment. My collar was still crooked from where she'd grabbed it. I straightened it with both hands, slow and steady, the way you do when you need your hands to have something useful to occupy them. I was 69 years old. My knees ached a little from the cold. My hair, which Diana had complained about every chance she got, was silver and cut short and clean. I was wearing my blue coat, the sensible one she called frumpy. Took one breath, then another, then I moved, but I did not follow them through the main entrance. I did not shuffle after them like a lost guest. I turned right at the base of the steps and walked along the side of the building to a smaller door, a plain gray door marked personnel only. There was a buzzer on the wall beside it. I pressed it once. A crackle of static, then a familiar voice. "Front security. Can I help you?" "Yes," I said. "This is Margaret Cole." "I'm expected." Was. Then the sound of a lock releasing. The door swung open and I stepped inside. 'Cause here is what Diana did not know. Here is what Thomas had never thought to ask. For 32 years, from the age of 34 to 66, I had been a family court judge in Callaway County. I had sat on the bench of this very building. I had made decisions that changed the course of people's lives. I had ruled on custody battles, estate disputes, guardianship hearings, and adoption petitions. My name was on a plaque in the main hallway. My portrait hung in the second-floor gallery alongside every judge who had served this county since 1954. Diana had been in this building many times. She practiced family law. She argued cases here at least twice a month. She had walked past that portrait. She had walked past my name on that plaque. She had never once looked closely enough to notice. She had never asked Thomas about my career. She had never asked me. I was simply Thomas's mother. Old Margaret, the woman who brought casseroles nobody ate. The woman who called on Sundays until the calls started going to voicemail. That was all she had ever needed me to be. I walked down the interior corridor, my shoes soft on the tile. The building felt familiar the way childhood homes feel when you return to them. Smaller in some ways, exactly right in others. The smell of old paper and cleaning solution and something faintly like coffee that had been warming too long. I knew this building in my bones. I knew which hallway led to the clerk's office. I knew which elevator was slow. I knew that the water fountain on the second floor had always run slightly warm. I had spent more time in this building than in my own kitchen. At the end of the corridor, seated behind a wide desk covered in color-coded folders, was my former clerk, Renata Price. Renata had worked with me for 19 years. She was now the chief administrator of the entire court system in Callaway County. She looked up when I came around the corner, and her face did what it always did when she was trying not to show too much feeling. Her mouth pressed together. Her eyes went soft. "Mrs. Cole," she said quietly. She had never called me Judge in personal moments. Always Mrs. Cole. I appreciated that about her. "You sure about today?" she asked. "I have been sure for 3 weeks," I told her. She nodded and reached into her desk drawer. She pulled out a lanyard with a visitor's credentials badge and a smaller sealed envelope. I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded sheet of paper. It was a formal letter from Chief Judge Harold Briggs, printed on court letterhead, requesting that I serve as a visiting adjudicator for the day's afternoon session in Room 7, specifically for the guardianship hearing scheduled at 1 o'clock. Renata had made the call. I had asked her to. I walked to the robing room on the second floor. It was a quiet room, long and narrow, lined with dark wood lockers. Smelled like cedar and old wool. My old robe was not there, of course. I had taken it home when I retired. But Renata had borrowed a spare from the court's inventory, the right size, pressed and hung neatly on the end peg. I set my handbag on the bench and took off my blue coat. I took off the sensible shoes Diana found so embarrassing. Put on the robe. It was heavy across my shoulders in the way that felt like settling, not like weight. I looked at myself in the long mirror on the back of the door. The woman looking back at me was 69 years old. Her face had the lines of a person who had done a great deal of listening. Her hands were steady. Her silver hair sat clean against the black of the robe. She did not look like someone's burden. She did not look frumpy. She looked, if I am being honest, exactly like herself. I had spent years making myself smaller to fit into the corner of my son's life. Standing there in that robe, I realized how much space I had given away. Renata met me at the door to the corridor and we walked together toward Room 7. The hearing that afternoon was a guardianship dispute. A family fighting over who should be legally responsible for an elderly woman who could no longer manage her own affairs. There was money involved. There was property. There was a daughter-in-law at the center of it, who had been pushing to have the older woman declared incompetent so that she could take control of her assets. The case had been assigned to a visiting adjudicator. That adjudicator, as of this morning, was me. I paused outside the door for one breath. Then I nodded to the bailiff and he pulled it open. The room was full. There were attorneys at both tables. There was a court reporter. There were observers in the gallery rows. And at the plaintiff's table, on the right side of the room, sat Diana Cole. She had her back to the entrance. She was leaning toward her client, speaking in a low, firm voice, one hand flat on the table, the other gesturing toward a stack of documents. She was completely in control and completely unaware. I walked to the front of the room. I climbed the 2 steps to the bench. I sat down. I placed my hands flat on the smooth surface of the desk and looked at the room. The bailiff announced me. The court officer at the side door said the words he had said in my courtroom for years. "All rise. Callaway County Family Court is now in session." The Honorable Judge Margaret Cole presiding. The rustling of people rising filled the room. And Diana turned around. I watched it happen the way you watch something falling. First her head turned. Then her whole body shifted, and then her face went through 4 or 5 different expressions in the space of about 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, denial, then something white and complete like a light going out. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. The folder she had been holding slid from her hands and landed on the table with a flat smack. The young associate beside her reached for it automatically, eyes forward, not yet understanding what had just happened to the woman sitting next to him. In the gallery, in the second row, Thomas had been sitting with his phone in his lap. I had not known he was there. When he heard my name, he looked up slowly, the way you do when you're not sure you heard correctly. And then he saw me. The color went out of his face entirely. He sat very still. He looked like a man who had just opened a door and found a room full of things he didn't know existed. I gave no indication that I had seen either of them. I adjusted my reading glasses. I looked at my notes. Please be seated. Everyone sat. Diana sat last, her movements stiff and strange, like a marionette whose strings had been tangled. Picked up my pen. I looked at the room calmly, the way I had looked at thousands of rooms over 32 years. This is the matter of Deering versus Deering, I said. A guardianship petition filed on behalf of Dorothy Deering, age 74, by her son Lawrence Deering. Counsel for the petitioner, please identify yourself for the record. The attorney on the left side stood. David O'Say for the petitioner, Your Honor. Thank you, I said. Counsel for the respondent. Diana was still sitting. Her associate nudged her elbow sharply. She stood. Her voice came out wrong, too high, too thin. Diana Cole, she said. Of Cole and Marsh Associates. Representing the respondent, Claire Deering. She swallowed. Your Honor. I let one beat of silence sit in the room before I looked down at my papers. Thank you, Ms. Cole. I want to start by reviewing the medical documentation submitted in support of the petition. I understand there was a supplemental filing from Dr. Harmon's office last week. Has counsel for both sides received that filing? Yes, Your Honor, said Mr. O'Say. Diana said nothing. I looked at her. Ms. Cole, I said again. Have you received and reviewed Dr. Harmon's supplemental filing? She blinked. Yes, she said. Your Honor. I wasn't sure if that pause before Your Honor was hesitation or something she was swallowing. I noted it and moved on. I had learned long ago that the most important thing a judge can do in the first 10 minutes of a hearing is establish the temperature of the room. The temperature of this room was already clear. Then let us begin with that document. But before I take you back to that courtroom and show you everything that unfolded in the hours that followed, I want to tell you who I was before I became the woman in the robe. Because this story does not begin outside the courthouse with Diana's hand on my collar. It begins much further back, in a small house on Ellery Street, with a 7-year-old boy and a mother who had just become the only thing standing between her child and the world. My husband Dennis died of a heart attack at 41. We had been married for 12 years. Thomas was 7. Dennis was a mechanic. He worked hard. He loved us simply and completely. When he died, he left behind a paid-off truck, a toolbox, a small life insurance policy, and a little boy who stood in the kitchen doorway the morning after the funeral asking me what we were going to do now. I told him we were going to be all right. I said it the way you say something when you don't yet know if it's true but you need it to be. Then I went to the county library and I sat at a long table and I started figuring out how. I had a degree in social work that I had never used. Dennis and I had planned for me to stay home with Thomas when he was small and I had been grateful for that time. But now I needed more than a social work degree to keep us housed and fed and whole. A woman I knew from church had gone back to school for law at 38. Called her. We talked for 2 hours. The week after Dennis's funeral, I enrolled in a night program at Callaway Community College to begin the pre-law coursework I still needed. Thomas helped me study vocabulary. I passed the bar exam on my second attempt at the age of 32. I took a job with the county prosecutor's office because it paid better than private practice at entry level and because I believed in it. I worked cases involving families in crisis, children in danger, elderly people whose rights were being trampled. I was good at it. I was thorough. I cared in a way that showed up in my work. After 8 years at the prosecutor's office, I was approached about a judicial appointment. I was 34 years old and I almost said no. I almost said no because Thomas was 15 and I was raising him alone, and the thought of more responsibility felt like being handed a heavier box when your arms were already full. But Thomas sat across from me at the kitchen table that night and I told him about the offer and he looked at me very directly. The way he used to look at me when he was small and entirely certain I knew everything, and he said, "Mom, you should do it." So I did. I was sworn in on a Tuesday in October. Thomas sat in the front row. For 32 years I served this county from that bench. I presided over thousands of hearings. I made hard decisions in hard cases. I saw families broken and sometimes helped put them back together. I cried in my car twice in those 32 years, both times over cases involving children. I gave everything I had to that work. I also made dinner every night. I went to every school event Thomas had. I taught him to drive in the parking lot of a grocery store on Saturday mornings. I was his mother the whole time. Both things were true at once. When Thomas met Diana at a legal conference 6 years after I had taken the bench, I was cautious but open. She was smart and polished and confident in a way that reminded me of attorneys I had admired in court. She shook my hand firmly the first time we met. She looked me in the eye. I thought, this is a woman who respects directness. I thought we might understand each other. I was wrong about that, the way you are wrong about something when you read only the first page. What I had read as confidence was something closer to assessment. She was deciding what I was worth. Over the years that followed, I watched myself slowly reclassified. In the beginning, I was Thomas's mother, a figure worthy of basic courtesy. Then I became a complication. Then I became a habit Thomas had that Diana found inconvenient. She never said this directly. Diana was too careful for directness. What she did was create friction around every moment that involved me. Sunday dinners started to conflict with plans she had already made. My calls to Thomas became calls that he took in another room, voice low. My invitations to family occasions arrived late or not at all. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself that young couples needed their space. I made myself smaller. I stopped calling as often. I stopped dropping by. I sent cards for birthdays and got brief text messages back. I retired from the bench at 66 with a small ceremony and a plaque and a gathering of colleagues who had worked alongside me for decades. Thomas did not come. He was traveling for work, Diana said in the text she sent the morning of. I drove home alone that evening with the plaque on the passenger seat, and I sat in my driveway for a while before going inside. I made a decision that night that I have regretted many times since. I decided not to tell Diana who I was. She had never asked. Thomas had never volunteered it. In the first years it had simply not come up, and then as the distance grew it felt almost spiteful to mention it, like correcting someone on a small point at the end of a long argument. So I said nothing. I put my robes in a box in the closet. I took down the framed commendations from the hallway and replaced them with family photos. I became simply Thomas's mother, old Margaret, and I let them believe it. I still saw Thomas occasionally. He would come alone sometimes when Diana was away or busy. On those visits he was more like himself, quieter, less performed. He ate my cooking. He sat on the back porch with me and sometimes we talked about real things. I held on to those visits. I told myself they were proof that underneath everything he was still my boy and that Diana was an influence, not a replacement. I held on to that for longer than I should have. Then 8 months ago I stopped holding on to it. It was a Thursday. I was in the garden when Thomas pulled into the driveway. He had not called ahead. He came through the gate quickly. Not with his usual half-distracted casualness, but with the tight stride of someone carrying something heavy. He sat down across from me at the garden table, and he looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Mom, Diana thinks it might be time to talk about your living situation." I set down my gardening gloves. I looked at my son. "My living situation," I said. He nodded. "Our house. The upkeep." He looked at the garden table. "She thinks it might be getting to be too much for you," he said. I waited. He continued, not meeting my eyes. "There's a really nice place. Meadow. You'd have your own room. Staff to help if you need anything." I listened to my son tell me, in the careful soft language of someone who has been coached, that my life as I had built it was too much for me to manage, that I needed to be placed somewhere, that the house, my house, the house I had lived in for 37 years, was going to be a lot to deal with, and maybe it made sense to think about selling. I said only one thing. "Whose idea is this, Thomas?" He was quiet for too long. I had my answer. He left 40 minutes later. I stood in the garden after his car disappeared. The soil under my hands was warm from the afternoon sun. My roses were in full bloom along the back fence. The kitchen window needed repainting, and I had been meaning to do it for 2 summers. This was my life. This was not too much for me. I had built this life with 32 years of hard work, and I was not going to be gently redirected out of it by a woman who didn't know my last name before she married into it. I went inside. I made a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table and I thought clearly. The way I had trained myself to think in difficult hearings, working through what I knew and what I needed to find out. Diana was a family law attorney. She knew exactly how guardianship proceedings worked. She knew what it took to have someone declared incompetent. She knew what happened to a person's assets when that declaration was granted. She had been in this process before on behalf of clients. Now I was the client, except I was not going to be. The next morning I called an old friend named Patricia Ames. Patricia had been one of the most respected estate attorneys in the county for 40 years. She was retired now and growing tomatoes in a greenhouse outside the city. She picked up on the third ring. When I told her what I needed, she didn't ask unnecessary questions. She said, "Come Thursday. Bring everything." I brought everything. My financial records, my medical history, my mortgage documents, the deed to my house, my retirement account statements. Patricia went through all of it at her dining room table while her cat walked across the papers. Over the next 3 weeks, Patricia and I rebuilt every wall of my life from the foundation. She redrafted my estate documents in a way that was airtight under any legal challenge. She connected me with a neurologist she trusted who administered a full cognitive evaluation. The results were what I already knew. My mind was entirely sound. The neurologist wrote a 4-page report saying so in language that would hold up in any court in any county. Patricia said, with some satisfaction, that if Diana filed a guardianship petition she would be dismantling it piece by piece before it reached a hearing. But I wanted more than defense. I had spent too many years defending myself quietly, absorbing, retreating, making myself easier to overlook. I wanted something that would restore what had been taken from me, not just legally but in a way that was true. I wanted my son to see, clearly and without any room for comfortable misunderstanding, exactly who his mother was. I was thinking about this on a Thursday afternoon when Patricia called me. She said, "Margaret, I just got off the phone with Renata Price over at Callaway Court. She had a very interesting thing to tell me." Renata had heard from Patricia that I was dealing with a family situation involving the court, and she had thought of something. There was a case on the docket in room 7. A guardianship dispute involving an older woman whose daughter-in-law was pushing to have her declared incompetent to gain control of her property. The assigned judge had developed a back problem and had been signed off for 4 weeks. They needed a visiting adjudicator, experienced in family and estate matters, available within 3 weeks. The lead counsel for the petitioning party was Diana Cole. I sat with that information for a full day before I called Renata. I thought about whether it was appropriate. I thought about the ethics of it from every angle I knew, and I knew a great deal of angles. I had no prior relationship with this case. I had no financial interest in the outcome. I was not ruling on anything involving my own family. The parties in room 7 were strangers to me, and I would preside over their hearing with the same rigor and fairness I had applied to every case in 32 years. The fact that Diana would be in the room was not a conflict of interest. It was simply circumstances. Called Renata and said yes. I did not tell Thomas. I did not tell Diana. The morning of the hearing, Diana had been in the courthouse lobby when I arrived. She was standing near the front entrance with 2 associates and a paralegal, reviewing documents, already commanding the space around her. She didn't see me come through the main door. I had almost walked past her when one of her associates stepped back and bumped into me, and Diana looked up. The contempt on her face arrived before anything else. Like a reflex, then came her hand on my collar. Then came her words, "Go home, old fool." Then came Thomas behind her, eyes down, saying nothing, choosing nothing. I straightened my collar, turned right. I went through the personnel door. And 8 minutes later I walked into room 7 in a black robe. Now let me tell you what happened inside that room, because that is where the real story lives. Diana's case was built on a familiar architecture. The elderly woman, Dorothy Deering, had become forgetful, her son claimed. She had missed bill payments. She had left the stove on. She needed protection. Diana was representing Dorothy's daughter-in-law, Claire, who was contesting the guardianship petition filed by Dorothy's son Lawrence. On the surface it looked like Claire was defending Dorothy's autonomy, but Patricia had given me the background. Claire had been pushing Dorothy for 2 years to sign over power of attorney. Dorothy had refused. The moment Lawrence filed his petition, Claire had counterfiled, not to protect Dorothy but to position herself as the preferred guardian and take control of what Lawrence would have controlled. Dorothy herself had stated in a written declaration that she trusted neither of them. Dorothy's own attorney, a young woman named Simone Adler who had been appointed by the court to represent Dorothy's independent interests, had filed a motion requesting that both the petition and the counter-petition be denied and that Dorothy be assigned an independent professional guardian with no family connection. It was a solid motion. I had read it twice that morning. It was the motion I would likely be granting. But first I had to hear the full arguments, and Diana had to make hers. I looked at her across the bench. "Ms. Cole, your client's counter-petition. Please walk me through it." Diana stood. She had gathered herself somewhat in the minutes since I had sat down. There was still something off in her posture, a rigidity that wasn't her usual controlled precision. But she was trying. She was not a bad attorney. She was actually, technically, quite competent. That was the difficult truth of it. But she had built her argument on the assumption that this would be a routine hearing before a visiting judge who would not look too closely. She began. "Claire Deering has maintained a consistent and caring relationship with Dorothy Deering for 11 years. He paused. I let the pause sit. Then I said, "Counsel, I've reviewed the communication records included in the filing. The most recent documented contact between your client and Dorothy Deering prior to the filing of this petition was 14 months ago. Can you help me reconcile that with the word consistent?" Diana's jaw tightened. She looked at her notes. "There have been in-person visits not captured in the formal record, Your Honor. Do you have documentation of those visits?" she asked. "I will allow you time to submit supplementary evidence. What I need right now is what you have in front of you." She had what she had in front of her. It was not enough. I could see her working to recalibrate, shifting her argument to avoid the gaps, but every time she moved the hole she'd stepped in, she stepped into another one. The opposing attorney, Lawrence's counsel, was thorough and well prepared. He let Diana make her own case difficult and only spoke when it was time to add weight to what was already obvious. Then Simone Adler stood. She was perhaps 30 years old and she spoke about Dorothy Deering with the calm precision of someone who had actually sat with her and listened to her. "Dorothy Deering is not confused," Simone said. "She is tired of being treated as a thing to be claimed. She has stated clearly in recorded and witnessed communication that she does not wish to be under the legal control of her son or her daughter-in-law. She wants to continue living in her own home with appropriate support. She is legally competent to make that wish. I am asking this court to honor it." There was a stillness in the room when Simone sat down. The kind of stillness that means something true has just been said out loud. I made a note. I looked at Diana. "Ms. Cole," I said, "your counter-petition relies on a determination of incompetence, but you have submitted no independent medical evaluation. You have referenced her son's petition, but your client's own documentation does not establish grounds for guardianship. What you have established is that your client wants a role in this woman's life that Dorothy Deering has not invited her to have." Diana was very still. "That is an oversimplification, Your Honor," she said carefully. "Explain to me what I am missing," I said. She couldn't. Not in the way that mattered. She had a theory of the case, but she didn't have the evidence, and she had not expected to need it because she had not expected to be here, standing before a judge who had spent 3 decades in family court, and who had read every piece of paper in that file, and who was not going to be moved by confidence or polish or the particular way Diana Cole had of filling a room. I took a 20-minute recess. When we returned, I delivered my ruling from the bench. I said, "This court has reviewed the original petition filed by Lawrence Deering and the counter-petition filed by Claire Deering acting through counsel Diana Cole. Having heard oral arguments and reviewed all documentation submitted, this court finds that neither petition meets the evidentiary standard required to establish grounds for guardianship. Dorothy Deering has not been demonstrated to be legally incompetent. Her stated wishes, documented in the declaration submitted by court-appointed counsel Simone Adler, are coherent, consistent, and legally valid. Both the petition and the counter-petition are therefore denied. Continued. Furthermore, this court is appointing an independent professional guardian of Dorothy Deering's choosing, as she has requested, for the limited purpose of assisting with administrative and financial management, should she choose to use those services. Dorothy Deering will remain in her home. This court will review her situation in 12 months. I struck the gavel. The room shifted. From the gallery there was a sound, a woman exhaling, and I knew without looking that it was Dorothy Deering's neighbor who had submitted a character letter. Diana did not move for several seconds. I gathered my papers. I did not look at Diana as I stood. I walked to the side door. I went through it. I was sitting in the robing room, the robe half removed, when the door opened. I expected Renata. I did not expect Thomas. He closed the door behind him quietly. He was not wearing his composed, professional expression. He looked like a man who had been walking fast and had just stopped. He looked like he was trying to find where to put something heavy he had been carrying. He stood near the door. He didn't come further into the room. "Mom," he said. The word sounded different than it had in a long time. I folded the robe over my arm. I looked at my son. "I want to ask you something, Thomas," I said. He nodded. "Why didn't you ask?" "That's all. In 32 years not once did you ask me what I had done with my life. Not in curiosity. Not in real conversation. When did you stop being interested?" He looked at the floor. Then he looked up. "Diana said you were private about it. That you didn't like to talk about work." He paused. "I let her tell me who you were," he said quietly. "I know that." I set the robe down on the bench. "I want you to think about something," I said. "When I was 44 years old I passed the bar exam. I had been raising you alone for 7 years by then. I studied at the kitchen table at night after you went to bed. Do you remember the coffee cups I used to leave in the sink in the morning?" He nodded slowly. "That's what those were," I said. "That was me becoming who I became. And you were the reason I kept going. You sat across from me one night and you said, 'Mom, you should do it.' You were 15. You told me to take the appointment. I never forgot that. I thought somewhere inside you understood what it meant for me. But somewhere along the way you decided that who I was could be summarized by Diana's opinion of me." Thomas's eyes were red at the edges. He pressed his hands flat against his thighs the way he had done as a boy when he was trying not to cry. I let him feel it. I did not soften it. Diana came into the room then. She came in without knocking, which was precisely like her. She stopped when she saw Thomas. She looked at me and her face had changed again. The mask she had worn all morning in the courtroom was gone. What I saw underneath it was something raw. Not shame exactly. Something closer to the first moment of understanding that the story she had been telling herself about who I was had simply never been true. She said nothing. I said nothing. Thomas looked at his wife and then looked at the floor between us. I picked up my blue coat from the bench. Put it on. Picked up my handbag. I looked at Diana and I said, "I want you to understand something clearly. What you did outside this building this morning is something I will not pretend did not happen. You put your hands on me. You called me a fool in public. You did that in front of people who then came into this room and watched me run a hearing. Whatever you thought about me before today, you know now that you were wrong. And so does every attorney who was in that lobby." Diana's face had gone very pale. She started to speak, and I held up one hand, gently but firmly, the way I had held up one hand in 32 years of courtrooms to indicate that the speaking portion of an argument was finished. "I have spent years making myself small," I said, "because I believed it was the price of being loved by my son. I am done paying that price. That doesn't mean I am done with Thomas. It means I am done pretending to be less than I am so that my presence in his life is easier to manage." I looked at Thomas. "I would like to have Sunday dinner with you," I said. "Without agenda. Without a conversation about my house or my living situation or what Diana thinks would be good for me. Just dinner. If you want that, you know where I live." I have lived there for 37 years and I intend to go on living there for as long as I am able. I walked to the door, opened it. I turned back once. The garden needs new edging along the south fence, I said. I was going to ask you to help me with it this spring. The offer stands. Then I walked out. The corridor was quiet. My footsteps were soft on the carpet. I passed the portrait gallery on my way to the elevator and I paused for a moment in front of my own portrait. It was painted the year before my retirement. I am wearing the robe. I look serious in the way that serious work makes you look serious. Beneath it the small gold plate reads, The Honorable Margaret and Cole, Family Court, Callaway County, 1989 to 2021. I had not looked at it directly in 3 years. I looked at it now. I thought about the woman who had stood in a library at 30 years old trying to figure out how to keep her little boy's world intact. I thought about the nights at the kitchen table. I thought about Thomas saying you should do it with all the certainty of a 15-year-old who believed entirely in his mother. I thought about 32 years of sitting in that high-back chair trying to see clearly and rule fairly in situations that were never simple. I thought about the garden and the roses along the fence and my kitchen and my life, which was mine. 2 weeks later, Thomas came for Sunday dinner. He came alone. He sat at my kitchen table the way he used to when he was young. He ate 2 plates of food. He did not talk about Diana. We talked about other things, small things, the kind of things you talk about when you are learning each other again from the beginning. Before he left, he stood in the garden with me for a while. He looked at the fence. I can come back next week, he said, to do the edging. I said that would be good. He nodded. I watched him drive away. I went back inside. I washed the dishes. Through the kitchen window, the last of the evening light was sitting low and golden on the garden. It occurred to me, standing there at the sink, that dignity is not something that comes back all at once. It comes back the way gardens come back in spring, quietly, steadily, one thing at a time, until one morning you look out the window and realize it was there all along. You just had to stop letting someone else tell you what you were looking at. Godfred's story time.
Okay, family, thank you for being with me till the end of this story, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel because I passed through a whole lot of stress to get you a quality story. That's why you see me sometimes dozing off in this video. Following and keep supporting the family. Thank you for watching.